Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Welcome to Get Gov Documents, a collaboration between Southside Weekly and the Better Government Association. You have two incredible people today who are going to be talking to you all things FOIA. And today we're going to cover quite a few things. We're going to talk about the FOIA that they've done in their work, both at Southside Weekly and Illinois Answers Project. We're going to talk about what and who can we FOIA, what can we request, what can we expect in a response, how long a response can take, and then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. So to let you know a little bit more about your presenters, Jim Daly is an investigative journalist and senior editor at Southside Weekly, where he helps run the paper's Community Investigations Hub. His investigation of how the Chicago police surveilled protesters during the George Floyd uprisings won the 2021 Lissagore for best in-depth reporting in a community newspaper. He was previously worked as a news editor at the Chicago Reader and the Tribe. Cam Rodriguez is a data reporter at the Illinois Answers Project, interested in the overlap between community engagement, investigative, and data reporting. Cam has done everything from research and archive database digging, creating graphics and interactive visualizations, editing and management, engagement strategy, public records, requests, and more. So you all are in very good hands. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to the two of them to take it from here.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Daly. I'm really excited about this workshop, and I'm so glad that so many people from so many different places came to learn a bit about the Freedom of Information Act request. So we're going to start off by just telling you about a few stories that we've written based on FOIA requests. So these are some that I've done for Southside Weekly. It was a couple of years ago that these were done. The one all the way on the left is about how the Chicago Police Department, while Chicago was erupting into protests following the police murder of George Floyd, the police department used their gun violence suppression unit to instead police and surveil protests. The second one is more sort of administrative, if you will. It's about how the overtime approval process in the Chicago Police Department is basically does not work the way that they publicly assert. And that's part of the reason that Chicago constantly is paying hundreds of millions of dollars in overtime. It has to do with the fact that there's just a lack of oversight, even though the department was claiming that there was. And then the third also came out of the George Floyd protests. This was about a cop who punched a protester in the face, knocking out her teeth during a protest. And while the Civilian Office of Police Accountability was investigating that particular incident, I dug into his background and turned up the fact that he had similar incidents involving abuse of young Black teenagers. And he was actually, he was separated from the department a couple years after this. And these are some stories that Cam and some other folks at Illinois Answers have worked on. Cam, can you discuss these?
Definitely, yeah. So the Illinois Answers Project, which might have been more typically known as the Better Government Association, we do all different types of stories and investigations that impact Chicago, Cook County, and the entire state now under Illinois Answers. That means we use a lot of FOIA all the time because oftentimes public data and public documents aren't as accessible as they should be. Agencies might not be as transparent as they're able to, or they, again, should be. And so it's really on reporters to kind of, seek out this information and request it from different agencies. So these are all examples of stories that my colleagues and former colleagues have done. We have a story by Rachel Hinton and Manny Ramos about how the city, again, only spent a small fraction of federal money it received dedicated for homeless programs. The middle from Joelle Jackson, Kelly Duncan, and Casey Toner, looking at empty buildings and like just vacancies within CPS facilities, particularly after the decision to close 49 schools over 10 years ago. And then a story from Matt Stroud about what happens at the end of a ShotSpotter contract. All three of these were really great investigative accountability stories, and used publicly available documents and data in order to really tell those stories. The next slide is some of my work. So in my role at Illinois Answers Project, I maintain and run our two very large databases, one which is focused on Illinois Pension Fund, just data and statistics, and then the other one is our Illinois Public Salaries database. This is one of the most comprehensive databases of employee salaries at different agencies, over 1,000 across the state of Illinois. And right now there's 2020 data. I am working very hard to get it updated, and all of that is entirely driven by FOIA as well. I have to send individual FOIAs to, again, over 1,000 different agencies across the state, which means got my hands full and my email inbox. But I guess if we want to go to the next slide, we can start talking about, different FOIA fundamentals and ways that you can implement FOIA in your own work.
Absolutely. And I just want to add that this database is a fantastic tool. It's one that I use in my reporting on a regular basis. So I highly recommend everybody checks it out. All right. So the question is, what can we FOIA? So broadly speaking, if it's a document that exists that has been created by most government agencies, it is subject to FOIA. So that includes, if you can think of it, it's included reports, forms, letters, emails, text messages, to some extent, electronic records, data sets, and more. You can generally, when you're sending a FOIA request, you can request that they provide the documents to you in electronic format, which is just a fancy way of saying that they'll email it to you or send you a link to a document download. Some other examples of the sorts of things you can look for, and these are things that I've used in my own reporting, are personnel files and disciplinary files of public employees, such as cops, certain police reports. So tactical response reports, which is what CPD calls a report that they file whenever they use force, incident and arrest reports. You can FOIA payroll data, as Cam just pointed out. You can FOIA business license data, 311 requests, traffic crash data, 911 information, restaurant inspection data. If you can think of the government doing something and creating a document related to it, then it's probably something you can FOIA.
I will say, to add on, it can get kind of outlandish. I mean, to add it, you can request emails as well. You can request calendars and visitor logs. And I think the most insane FOIA request I filed is there is an actual government document that has a list of every piece of media that is on the International Space Station. So that was a federal FOIA that I filed to NASA and actually got back the list of all of the movies that they have. I think they have Shrek 2, but not Shrek 1. It's a very fascinating list.
That's cool. That's really cool. All right. So who or which agencies can we FOIA? So people ask me from time to time whether you can file a FOIA request about a nonprofit or a corporation, and the answer is no. FOIA law only covers public bodies, which means government agencies, whether it's the executive branch, agencies that are doing things like the Department of Transportation. Court records, at least in Illinois, are exempt from FOIA. So you can't FOIA, for example, a judge's email the way that you could FOIA a cop's. But outside of that, any municipal, state, or county agency, such as the health department, parks, the police, fire department, schools, legislative, executive, administrative, and advisory bodies, which means the city council in Chicago, the mayor, the civilian oversight of the police agency, various advisory bodies. I can't think of one off the top of my head. And then federal agencies are covered by the federal government's FOIA Act, which is separate from state FOIA acts, and the laws are a little bit different for those. In Illinois, at least, all FOIA officers have to complete a training once a year. They're not required to register with the Public Access Counselor, which is a state oversight body that we'll get into later. They're required to respond to records in a timely manner. That doesn't always mean that they do. And they're also required to have a list of documents where if it's something that is regularly requested, they can just send it right back out. Once again, they don't always do that. And you can also look at websites of individual agencies, but you might have to search or call to find out more about FOIA officers. All right, so what can you request? And to figure out what to request, you first have to find out what they have. So one way to do this is to first send a FOIA request for what's called a records retention schedule. This is basically just a list of documents that an agency is required to retain or keep, and it just tells you the sorts of stuff that you can ask them for. Sometimes records retention schedules, that's difficult to say, are posted online. The Chicago FOIA webpage, which is on the right side of this slide at the top, has a good job of listing the documents that are typically maintained, but you can also request those. Another way to figure out what documents there are is to look at the agendas of various government boards meetings and or attend those meetings, and then see if a report has been made to the board, or if anything has been submitted to the board. You can file FOIAs for those reports. Another way to do this is to look into what other journalists have already FOIA'd. So Muckrock, which is this bottom picture, is a website that's dedicated to, or it's an organization rather, that's dedicated to sort of transparency. And they not only assist reporters in filing FOIAs, it's a place where reporters can often post their results. And so a lot of the time I'll go to muckrock.com and search for keywords that I'm looking to FOIA to see how other journalists have worded their requests. You can also FOIA other people's FOIA requests. So you can send a FOIA request for all FOIA requests related to something, just to see what kind of stuff other journalists are getting. You can search for PDFs. This is a great way to find documents. I've used it before in my reporting, where you can search a website for all PDFs that are on that website. You can also do a Google search for a keyword and make the file type PDF and see what comes up too, but that's separate from FOIA. So these are some of the ways that you can sort of get a sense of what documents are there for you to look for. Okay, so this slide is basically describing the FOIA approach. So there's a few different ways that I approach filing FOIAs, and they're based on how much I already know about what I'm looking for. So these are those three stories that we showed you at the top of this presentation. And I'm going to go from the right side of your screen to the left. So the cop who attacked Miracle Boyd, that was a FOIA request where I was looking for a very specific document. After this incident happened, I was able to determine which log number the civilian police oversight agency in Chicago had given the case where this officer attacked Miracle Boyd. And from that, I was able to figure out what the officer's name was. So then the specific document that I was going for was this officer's personnel file, which includes his disciplinary history. So I simply requested that. And I got back, I think it was like an 80+ page document of his disciplinary file that showed all of the other complaints that have been filed against him over his career. And from that, I found this incident in 2009 where he beat up a different teenager. In the middle story, who's supervising overtime, I didn't know precisely what sort of endpoint information I was looking for. I didn't know precisely what the answer to the question, how well is the CPD supervising overtime, was. But I did know that they have an electronic timekeeping schedule or timekeeping system, and that I could FOIA downloads from that system, a database, a spreadsheet basically, that showed every single overtime request, the officers who made it, a lot of detailed information. And in there, I found that it also included which supervisor was approving the overtime. And the point of this story was the police superintendent had claimed that all of the top brass was supervising overtime, but the spreadsheet that I got showed that it was actually lower ranking supervisors like sergeants who were approving overtime, which showed that the superintendent was a lie. This last one on the left, surveilling dissent, this started out as a fishing expedition during the George Floyd protests. I had seen that there was some interagency communication around an incident where the Chicago police showed up at a nonprofit that was like sheltering teenagers during some unrest and protests and riots that were happening downtown, and that the police had coordinated with other agencies to raid that site. So I got interested in figuring out how that coordination happened. And I learned that this Summer Operations Center, which was ostensibly their gun violence prevention unit, had been involved in that specific coordination. That was all I knew at the start of this, was that the SOC coordinated that one raid. So what I started doing was FOIAing all of the meeting notes and agendas that I could from the Summer Operations Center. I FOIA'd every single PowerPoint slide deck that had ever been produced by the Summer Operations Center. And from that broad fishing expedition, I was able to put together enough documents that showed that CPD had completely shifted the gun violence prevention unit over to surveilling and arresting protesters. And that's the story that won the Lissagore Award.
It's a very well-deserved Lissagore Award as well.
Thank
So completely different from the situations that Jim outlined. Like, you know what you want to request, but you need to request it from a lot of different places. That's the whole point of the public salaries database, is having standardized data that is all in one place, in one repository, for people to be able to search through and make comparisons of, particularly, you know, within governmental bodies like counties, but also even down to the township and sanitation department level. So Illinois has a lot of governments. It has the most special districts out of any state. The census recognizes, I think, over 6,000 units of government, which is a little absurd, but it means that there are a lot of different people at every single agency, or a lot of different people that are responsible for these documents, just like scattered throughout the state. And sometimes it might be the person that is like comms person, it might be a director, it might be just someone who's there part-time and they're the only person who's in an office. All of that said, with the public salaries database, it's one request, and I do need to give full credit to Jared Rutecki, who originated the database, and asking for first name, last name, I think title, department, start date, like hire date, and then salary, base salary. If it's hourly, then the amount of hours worked, and then and this is what sets the database apart, is any bonus compensation, any overtime deductions, stuff like that. It is a labor of love, emphasis on labor, and it's definitely a really unique process in that, you know, we're sending on such a large scale one request to, again, I think I said earlier, over 1,000 different agencies. And I think hopefully next year it'll be over 2,000 agencies. But yeah, it is definitely a situation where managing it becomes the, I think, largest challenge, aside from having to fish for it, because we know exactly where the documents are. Now, that said, it is not without often explaining to FOIA officers what I'm looking for and why. Sometimes I have to request for staff rosters separately if the file that they have doesn't meet all of the requirements that we're looking for. Oftentimes I'm hopping on the phone and talking to FOIA officers directly, particularly if it's a smaller town or township. And again, because it's statewide and there's so many different varieties of government bodies in the state of Illinois, it really is just, it could be someone in the city of Chicago who handles 10, 20 requests a day, or it could be someone who maybe gets 10 requests a year and might need a little extra guidance in what we're looking for. So with the next slide, leading into knowing what you're looking for. So you know what you want to request, but now what do you do? How do you request it? And how do you go about that process? So FOIA requests must be submitted in writing. I will say a fun quirk about Illinois is that they do have to take it in the format that you give it to them. So this could be a letter, could be an email. There might be agencies that will direct you gently or not so gently to a FOIA portal. I'm probably going to get hate about this from FOIA officers, but you do not have to use the portal. If you have an email contact, say it's even just like a county clerk usually, or a village administrator, you are more than welcome by law to send them the FOIA request via email. They can't reject it and force you to submit it through a portal. So don't believe them when they tell you that. That said, the government is not required to answer general queries or questions or create records. So if you were asking like, how many bike crashes were there in 2020? Like, they don't necessarily have to respond to that general query unless there's a specific document that was created that has that exact response, or if they're maybe feeling benevolent. You can frame your request though to obtain information. So the way that Jim kind of described earlier with the different stories, being able to say like documents sufficient to show the amount of bike crashes in 2020, or policies and procedures related to reporting on bike crashes in 2020. I also whip out the any and all documents, which can sometimes get you in a little bit of hot water for being too broad or unduly burdensome, which we'll talk about in a sec. But it really is a matter of kind of playing the game and figuring out exactly what language you need. That's why it's so great to look at other people's FOIA requests as well. You can ask for the documents in the form that you want them in. Again, printed, electronic, a specific file format. As a data reporter, this is super important because oftentimes I need documents that are machine readable. That's definitely the case for the salary database. That said, do I receive the documents in a format that are machine readable? Not always. I've gotten everything from letters that have been sent in of printed out Excel spreadsheets. I've gotten photos of people handwriting the data onto a sheet of lined paper. I've also gotten the most beautifully formatted and color-coded spreadsheets I've ever seen. So you can ask for specific file formats, but be warned that Illinois state statute does say that there could be a fee involved with files over a certain size if they're not in a PDF format. If you're asked to narrow a request, similarly to the general queries and framing your request to get information, definitely feel free to get a FOIA officer on the phone or respond via email and ask them questions so you can get the records and information that you want. The way to think about it is this is their job, and you also have a job as well. If you're a reporter or if you're just a really engaged citizen and you want to learn more, like, it is your right. It is federal law and state law, and they have to abide by it. But it is also like I view it as a partnership. And so it's a lot easier to get the documents you need when you are nice and assume things in good faith. And that said, also for non-commercial requests in the public interest, so for media, for people working at nonprofits, or for researchers and students, you can request a fee waiver in Illinois in order to waive any fees that you might rack up. Be careful though, in the sense that it might save you from, printed out documents, like physical records that you would receive, but depending on how complex the documents are and the records, they might try and slip in fees for the labor cost of, maybe, again, if you're requesting from a database, the labor of running the database, or if you're requesting emails, the labor involved with redacting emails, if there's personal information as well. And then this is the big one. I feel like this is something that I always need to drill into my head at all times. Multiple agencies might have the records that you're seeking, and you should FOIA every single one of them. You'd be surprised how differently different agencies handle documents and handle especially redactions, and what they deem to be personal information that they need to redact for their agency's purpose. So again, it's really true. Like I said earlier, you can request emails, super true for emails. And for the, text messages and other things that might toe the line of more personal stuff and a mix of also stuff that public officials are doing in the public's interest. So with that said, send FOIAs to any agency that you think might have responsive records and compare the responses you get. The worst thing they can say is no, like they don't have any records. And that's also a really good clarifying point as well. But Jim has a great example of what happens when you FOIA a bunch of different agencies for the same document. Jim, you want to expand on it?
Yeah, so this gets back to that story about the gun violence unit switching over to surveilling protests. The way that that unit operated, it was a unit dedicated to coordinating responses between a whole bunch of different agencies. So almost every Chicago agency that I could think of was involved in this information sharing. And so any email that was sent out from the Chicago police via the Summer Operations Center to other agency heads went to every single agency head. The CPD, especially during 2020, because of, I think, COVID, but also the protests, was extremely slow to respond to FOIA requests. And CPD is often very, shall we say, zealous about redactions. So for these emails, I would just, whenever I requested an email from CPD that I knew was going to the group, I would make the same request to every other single agency to expedite the responses. And again, like Cam said, to see who redacts what. And some emails that came back redacted from CPD, other agencies, I won't say which, but occasionally did not redact them as well. So it gave me a bigger picture and also helped show the degree to which, for example, the Chicago Park District versus Streets and Sand was involved in the protest response. Streets and Sand was involved in the protest response because they used huge trucks that are owned by Streets and Sand to block off streets during the protest. Parks really wasn't. They didn't have anything to do with the protest. They just got these emails and didn't send anything out. So that helped build a better picture of this multi-agency approach. But ultimately with emails, it's always good to ask both the sender and the recipient at either agency to share it with you just to see what they redact. And it usually doesn't take much extra time to replicate those efforts because you just copy paste the request and send it off to the new email address. Okay, so this section's about figuring out who to send the requests to. In Illinois and Chicago, it's actually pretty straightforward. These are these links? I think they are. We put links in here. Okay. So, for example, everyone can see this website now, right? Yeah. Okay. So Illinois just lists all of the different FOIA officers that you could ever want to contact at the state level. There's tons. Chicago does the same on its own dedicated website here. And the federal government does as well. This image over here shows the Chicago public, the FOIA portal, which Cam mentioned earlier. I'm actually a big fan of this portal. It's a government website, which means it's not fun to use. It's like janky and old and often like kicks you back to the login for unclear reasons. But one of the things that it does really well is it organizes all your FOIAs for you. And Cam is fantastic at keeping FOIA databases, as you'll see later. I'm not so great at updating them. And so I, perhaps unwisely, tend to rely on this site a little bit to keep track of some of my FOIAs for me. But that's basically how you find out where to send those requests. And if you can't find something like this, a list, like this is Illinois specific. So for example, in New York or California, I don't know if those states have similar lists. They probably do. But if they don't, and you're trying to figure out who the FOIA officer at an agency is, you can just reach out to the agency. Just pick up the phone, try to get to the front desk and ask them to connect you with the FOIA officer, and they usually can. And if not, you can usually talk to their press contact, and that person will know who the FOIA officer is and where you can send FOIAs. Okay, so let's take a look at a sample FOIA request. This is basically a boilerplate that I paste into any email that I request FOIAs for. When I go through that portal that I showed you on the last slide, I don't usually include all of this information because It's not really necessary, and most of this is implied. You don't have to do this. This is a very thorough way to send the email that I used to use because I was basically insecure that they wouldn't take me seriously if I didn't show that I knew the law. And so this was meant to show that I know the law, and also like create sort of a legal trail if I needed to later go back to that public access counselor that I mentioned earlier, and we'll get back to later, to show that I've done my due diligence. Like everything I did was right. They are improperly denying this. But all of you are welcome to copy and paste this into any FOIA request that you make. But basically, some form of this is in any email that I send, whether I'm pasting this or not. So first, I identify who I am and what organization I'm with. And I also say that I'm making the request as part of a news gathering effort. That's actually really important because it signals to the FOIA officer that you're not a commercial entity making this request, because the law is different for commercial entities than for journalists who are making the requests in the public interest. So, and for example, like with CPD, they get tons of FOIA, the police department gets tons of FOIA requests from attorneys, often who, like traffic attorneys who are litigating a traffic crash and want like poll camera footage or something like that, or or reports on that. And this way I show them I'm not a lawyer, I'm a journalist. You need to pay more attention to me, basically is how I think of it. I don't know if they think of it that way. And then separately at a bullet point, I often bold the bullet point, like the text next to the bullet point, to make it very clear this is what I'm asking for. And then very clearly state I want these records from you. If I'm requesting many records, I will split this up into multiple requests and send them, you know, either one after another or spread over a few days so that they don't tell me that it's an unduly burdensome request. But often you can bullet a couple few different requests, especially, for example, if you're asking for email keywords. If you're doing a phishing expedition, you're looking for email keywords and you don't know exactly which one is going to generate a hit, you can bullet all of those different keywords, or just list them all in the same request and treat it as one request. I then have some legalese under here that tells them, I know that you know that I know how to do your job, so you better do it right. That's all this is saying. You can't withhold documents in their entirety if only parts are exempt. You have to redact them. You have to get this back to me within 5 days, even though I know you won't. And if they are electronic, please provide them in that way. This is basically a summation of everything we went over in the last couple dozen slides in a request. Okay, now that 5 days just came back up. When can we expect a response? So they're required to respond within 5 business days. The 5 business days after they receive the request. So if you put a request in the mail, the clock doesn't start ticking until that letter has hit their desk. However, if you're emailing your request, as soon as the email hits their inbox during business hours, that counts as a day. So if you can email a request at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, the clock starts Tuesday and they have 5 business days from Tuesday. If you send it at 6 p.m., it starts on Wednesday. However, that 5 days, they're granted the right to ask for an extension if it's too hard and they can't do it in 5 days. And a lot of places will just automatically take that. Some places that I FOIA, so like the police department for a long while was, as soon as you filed a FOIA request, like within minutes, you would get that 5-day extension back. Other places, for example, the mayor's office, if you file a FOIA request, and many other agencies do this, they will wait till end of day on the 5th day to ask for that extension. They get that extension, you can't fight it. But after that additional 5 days, they have to give you your documents. And if they don't at that point, then they've improperly denied it, which is something we'll get back to later. But let's see. Oh, we mentioned it here too. I'm sorry. So a non-response is a denial. They can also, so they can ask you, occasionally I have FOIA officers like say, hey, this is just taking me, I just need a couple more days. This just happened to me recently. This is a huge file, I need a couple more days. And I almost always say yes, just because you can't really like force them to give it to you before they're done redacting it anyway. And as Cam said, it's generally good to keep a collegial relationship with FOIA officers because they're overwhelmed and they're just trying to do their job. However, if that 10-day hits and they have not given you your records and they're stonewalling you, now they have improperly denied. Also, if you're going to agree to any extension, for it to count, it has to be in writing. So like if you say yes over the phone, they'll usually want to follow up with an email confirming that. And if they don't, then for legal purposes, they have not been given the extension, and that'll become important later. All right.
This color-coded monstrosity. So the best way to make sure that you are keeping track of how many FOIAs you've sent, what the deadlines are, and when you should be expecting that response within 5 days or whatever time frame they give you. This is by keeping a FOIA log. I know that some people did provide suggestions in the comments, like in the chat. There is like FOIA Machine, which is run by Muckrock, which is kind of an automated FOIA service. I just use a Google Sheet, and you can see I use a lot of color coding. This is the FOIA log for the Illinois Public Salaries Database for keeping track of, again, about over 1,000 FOIA requests. I broke it down by agency, and whether or not they're completed is green. So if that's helpful, yellow is in progress, blue is extended, black is closed. There are a lot of other colors in there too. But the way that I tend to keep track is anytime I file a request, I put in a description of the request, the body of the request itself, like the types of documents I'm searching for, the date that I filed, and then I use some fun Excel Google Sheets magic to tell me the date that it's due. I also, for personal curiosity purposes, I keep track of the date that they say it's going to be due, like the date that it's acknowledged, and then the day that it's fulfilled. So I can keep track of how long each agency took to get back to me. That's really more for record keeping purposes for myself. And then the other big thing is keeping track of who is actually responding. So if I am sending an email to a general FOIA inbox, like a FOIA at, I don't know, like riverside.org or .gov, then I want to keep track of who is responding and whether it is a paralegal, if it's a city clerk, if it is someone else entirely, and if they have FOIA officer in their name, so that I can keep track of that for the future. We do have a link at the bottom of a link to a blank FOIA tracker template that's similar to this one and less overwhelming. It does have less color coding, but it definitely is a skeleton that I use frequently, not just for this project, but also for my day-to-day work as well. But like Jim was saying, the next slide, they deny your request. Now what? Going into more detail about different denials and breaking that down and what that looks like. So again, the agency must require by statute a written explanation for why they denied the request, including any specific withholdings as described in the statute. So an example could be it's private or personal information. It could be a draft document and subject to a clause called deliberative process, where it's not a final document. It could be a document that's protected under attorney-client privilege or trade secrets, which is also a federal level. All of these are federal level, I think. It could be research materials or research data, which again could kind of fall under deliberative process or trade secrets. Could be certain law enforcement records. For example, for the public salary database, I've received redactions or partial denials for documents if it's specifically relating to officers that might be undercover, for example. And then, contracts while under negotiation are not always subject to being disclosed. Agencies will likely cite a portion of Illinois FOIA, or they will say it is, my two least favorite words, unduly burdensome, which effectively means, like Jim described, it's too much of a burden on the day-to-day process of the office, of the staff. And when you keep in mind that a FOIA officer could just be a person who's in like a couple days a week, or they could be one person, say in the mayor's office, who is constantly swamped with documents all the time, it is definitely, makes more sense when you put it in that context. And if you do get a response back that is saying it's unduly burdensome, you can narrow or appeal your request, and you might be asked by the agency to narrow or appeal your request, just to limit it in scope so that they're able to tackle it in full instead of denying it entirely. And if you do not respond, say if an agency comes back and they're like, you need to narrow this request, and you're like, no, like I'm not going to narrow the request. They have the right to deny it if it is still unduly burdensome. If they also ask you to narrow and you decline by not responding on your end, then it becomes an automatic denial as well. And if you think that they denied your request improperly, they didn't respond within a 10-day time window, or they're just kind of, again, being obstinate and not responding, there is legal recourse available.
That's when it gets fun.
It gets really fun. It gets fun and sometimes petty. I say sometimes, I mean kind of all the time. So you can now accept the response or non-response or the denial, or you can request a review within 60 days of the denial to the PAC, the Public Access Counselor, who works with the Attorney General's office in Illinois. They're like an ombudsperson for FOIA. And you can file an administrative appeal of a FOIA with the designated appeal authority for a federal level request. And then the nuclear option is filing a lawsuit. And an appeal is mandatory for the federal level to file a lawsuit. It's not mandatory at Illinois' level, but it is recommended just because I think it gives you a stronger case. Let's see. Yeah, so the Public Access Counselor, she issues binding and non-binding decisions on FOIA disputes, which are all listed online. They have a really helpful index as well on the AG's website. And they also have it broken down by year, and you can read through them in their entirety. I do that for fun because I'm a very fun person. And it's definitely really insightful. It gives really specific scenarios and agencies and kind of walks through the agency's process versus the requester's process. You could submit a written request to the PAC as well. We put the email and address on the screen, but it's also on their website. The public body responds to a request to review, and the process is free, but it can come at the cost of time. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about the process of working with the PAC?
Yeah, I mean, so when I first started doing this a few years ago, I was shocked to find out that when the Illinois Attorney General's Public Access Counselor tells the FOIA officer, you have improperly denied this FOIA request, that's all that happens. There's no enforcement to them, generally speaking, and at least when it came to the Chicago police, they just ignored that. But like Cam said, what it is useful for is you then have evidence that you can show a judge that an official body agreed with you, that the official body agreed with you, that the denial was improper. And the judge does have enforcement powers, of course. So, a lot of the time when I am suing for records, the attorneys will recommend that we contact the PAC first, just to get that additional piece of evidence for litigation. But they don't always. Sometimes it's such an obviously wrong denial that they don't need that. And this is especially the case when, or at least in my specific experience, that has especially been the case when the improper denial was that they just never responded, because that's very easy to prove. So yeah, I don't rely on the PAC to help me, but I do use them to help gather evidence for lawsuits sometimes. Was this me or you, Cam, this slide?
I mean, you can take it if you want. I feel like,
and then let's just talk about it together. So in Chicago, the preeminent FOIA law firm is Lovie and Lovie. The way that they work is they work for reporters for free, effectively. Their fee is basically whatever whatever monetary judgment is levied against the agency that violated FOIA, they get to keep, so you don't get the settlement that comes back. But what that means is they get paid when they win. So they want to take cases that they can win. So generally speaking, if they're taking your case, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to win. However, the courts move very slowly. So when you have to file a lawsuit to get records, it's not going to get you the records any faster than any other avenue would. I mean, it will, in the sense that other avenues just won't get you the records potentially, but the lawsuit's going to take at least a year usually to get those records, because they just have to schedule multiple hearings, then the judge has to think about it and issue her ruling. But that said, you can still file the lawsuit, let the lawyers start doing that work for you to get those documents, and then you don't have to just sit there and wait for them to do that. You can keep reporting the story. So you can wait for the lawsuit if there's no other way to go about this. But sometimes you can find sources. You can look at ways to request the same documents from other agencies if they're shared. You can try to file slightly different records requests that can get you information that can help you report out that story, because it's just important to remember that it's important to not get tunnel vision on the specific document that you're looking for. Keep fighting for that document, but also look around for other opportunities to get to the story. Did you want to add anything else, Cam?
I mean, yeah, you really just, to double down on that second or that last point, there's so much reporting that can be done with FOIA, but there's also so much reporting that can be done in spite of FOIA, and in spite of, an agency potentially blocking you from gaining access to documents. So that is something that, taking the downtime in between FOIA requests, and not even like a denial, but the deluge of extensions. Like, I've received from one agency, I received 13 extension requests, which is a all-time record for me personally. And in the meantime of waiting for those documents, I just did other work, and I developed, other stories out, or requested for different documents from different agencies to try and work around the problem. And in the meantime, you want to make sure that you have a paper trail. It's important to call people on the phone and, at least hopefully not make it an adversarial relationship where it's like you and the FOIA officer butting heads the whole time. But at the same time, you want to make sure you follow up on those conversations in email and writing, just in case it does lead to litigation and you do need to have proof and evidence of the fact that you were working within guidelines to get these records. But I think I don't know if I have anything else to add other than Lovey and Lovey, really good lawyers. So.
They're the best. They're the best. Yeah. So these are some additional resources for you. It is a template of Cam's FOIA tracker here. This is a list of some of the FOIA resources that we talked about. And this, I believe, takes you to the Illinois FOIA request portal, right? Oh, it's a sample request. There we go. To you. So these are a few resources for everybody. And that's it. I'll leave the last slide up so you all can copy those too. But I think everybody's going to get a copy of these slides at the end of the session as well. Is that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen then.
Yeah.
That sounds good. I know that like throughout the presentation, we had some questions pop up in the chat. We're also coming up at the end of the hour, but I think we can take some time now to address some of those, or also if people want to come off mute and comment on anything, or have a question like that they really want to get answered, feel free to do so as well.
Nobody has questions. We were so thorough. And
I think, okay. I think scrolling up in the chat, we can see some. I think Dylan asked, do you need to say who you are, what you will be using the request for? And when they say that there's a fee, do they give you the opportunity to try to waive it?
So the answer to the first question is absolutely not. You can file a FOIA request completely anonymously. FOIA officers are not allowed to ask you why you're making the request, and you don't have to volunteer that information at all. For the fee, do you know, Cam? I've not really had a lot of experience with fees.
Also, I will say, humble brag, I haven't had to pay a single cent for any FOIA requests I've sent, which is incredible. And I'm sure my employers are very happy about as well. Um, I think sometimes fees can come into play when there's a misunderstanding of a non-commercial request and when you're requesting a fee waiver. I've had agencies tell me before, like they're like, this is going to cost $40. Like before we submit or we send the documents to you, you need to remit payment to us. Like they wanted me to mail them a check. And then I just kind of explained like, I don't know if you missed this in all of the legalese that I sent you like last month, but I did request a fee waiver. And then I just kind of gently remind them like this is in the public's interest. And oftentimes they're like, oh, sorry, like didn't see that. And usually it is just a matter of hopping on the phone with them and clarifying. But yeah, I think as long as you like I always put it in the body of my original request, but I do think as long as you clarify with them, like they don't have your credit card on file, like they're not going to charge you automatically, like it is a process. So it's definitely something that you can talk about with the FOIA officer.
And the one experience, Tatiana makes a good point that other states other than Illinois may not have fee waivers. I ran into this once. I was doing a story about like childhood vaccination rates during the pandemic and getting that data from every single state's Department of Health. And Louisiana is terrible about this. They wanted to charge me, they wanted me to pay for like one nurse and two FOIA officers to do 8 hours of work at an average of like $50 an hour or something. And I was like, I'm a freelancer. I'm not even making that much for this article. Could you please waive the fee? And it turns out they just don't. And I talked to some FOIA people down there who were like, yeah, it's just, that's the way it is in Louisiana. So yeah, your mileage may vary.
I think we have another question about targeting documents from organizations that are or claim to be outside the purview of FOIA, such as private companies. If you scroll up, do you see Jason's question? Yeah.
I do. I mean, any engagement with a public body can be requested. So if it's an email, but it's from, say, like a private contractor, like maybe it's like Sodexo or something, like you can request for the domain with a public employee or a public official. Personal experience, like in FOIAing, I went to a private university. I went to DePaul, go Blue Demons, and it's a private university. And so they're not subject to FOIA. But through research and doing fishing expeditions like Jim described, I found out that for COVID outbreaks, for example, they have to report those to the Illinois Department of Public Health, and all colleges and universities have to do that. So that was a way that I was able to kind of circumvent the university like not reporting on COVID outbreaks themselves and disclosing them to students, and instead being able to just like go around them and like find the public body that they have to contract with, particularly if the school, which many colleges and universities do, receive federal funding. There are aspects that will be subject to FOIA, like the Clery Act and Clery Act violations and things like that. I mean, they might try and give you a hard time depending on whether or not it's a draft document, it's a trade secret, it's deliberative process. But if it's, say, like a bid that they filed with the city, like that's something that is a public document. Like that is something that, you know, was engaged in like goods and services. Like that is, you know, completely subject to FOIA. Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I agree with all that. Like, so if an entity is, if a private entity is or a nonprofit entity is doing some sort of business with the government, there's going to be communications and reports. Look for those communications and reports. There's one example I can think of where the University of Chicago Crime Lab, this was a private entity, right? It's a private university, was doing work for the Chicago police. And a judge ruled that partnership was subject to FOIA, and that made the crime lab's work subject to FOIA. But that's kind of the exception that proves the rule, because that was a whole big case that was like, wow, like, you know, amazing that they won. But generally speaking, yeah, you want to go for reports and communications.
Absolutely. I'm looking through the chat at other questions. Um, there was a question early on about, and I'm taking this one because I'm a data reporter, about getting machine readable documents. So do you have any suggestions for wording to use to ensure you're not going to get a spreadsheet that you can't fully decipher because some of the data is encrypted, or a suggestion for a sentence to add to the request along the lines of, please include a key/guide to abbreviations or encryption? So the thing that I've run into with this with data is um, FOIA officers are not always very technologically savvy. So a lot of times if I'm requesting data, especially if it's from like a database where I'm asking them to query data for me, like that can take time. I will say that something that I'll ask for when I ask for data is any related dictionaries or documents that are associated with the data, any notes, if it's like a proprietary, or not proprietary because it's public, but if it's a really specific program that they run, I'll ask for a data dictionary just in case field names are abbreviated or cut short. This is particularly the case with geographic data and spatial data, because there are file limitations. So oftentimes you will have to abbreviate file title names or field names. I will say that I just throw in the word machine readable, and then I give them a list of file formats that typically I'm looking for. Like I will just straight up type like a whole string of file extensions. I'm like, give me one that falls in one of these categories, or give me a PDF that has been run through OCR. And if it hasn't been run through OCR, then I run it myself. I will say with the Chapman ruling and the Illinois Supreme Court ruling earlier this year, there are some challenges I think that might come up depending on the agency when it comes to getting a schema, like a database schema, which is what the Supreme Court case was about earlier this year, or getting a dictionary or something to describe the data itself. That to me feels like a great Lovie and Lovie situation to reach out to them about. But I mean, again, I just always assume in good faith, and just try to make the job as straightforward as possible for a FOIA officer so that I have the greatest chance of success to get back what I want. Yeah. Looking at other questions, Jim, are there any that stand out to you?
There are. I've answered a few in the chat. One was that I saw is whether you can FOIA documents that haven't been created yet, but will, and the answer is no. If it does not yet exist, a FOIA officer will say, if it does not yet exist as of the date of your FOIA request, they're going to deny it. I think there's a degree, and this is not to cast any shade on FOIA officers, but I think there's a degree to which they are swamped with requests. So if they get one that's like clearly, oh, I can say no to this, they're just going to get that off of their list as quickly as possible a lot of the time. I love the machine readable and this data. I didn't know about this data dictionary. This is a great point.
Yeah.
For this last question, how do you find prior successful requests? So one way to do that is to FOIA all FOIA requests and responses. You can FOIA. So another way is that generally, so like they're not very good about this, but agencies are generally supposed to, or generally do rather, post FOIA responses online in some repository. That repository might be a year or two out of date, but it's a good place to start. It's going to be a government website, so it's not going to be beautifully searchable or anything like that, but it's a start. And you can also you can just talk to other journalists. I mean, I've reached out to other journalists that are on the beats that I cover to be like, hey, have you ever looked for this stuff? What kind of documents do you look for? And they're always really helpful. So those are the ways that I would go. And then again, Muckrock is another great place. You should always just go there and search for what you're looking for to see what's there.
Absolutely. I'm writing up a response right now, but I can address it probably just more generally. Can you talk about how to appeal a denied FOIA? Typically the way that I start is I'll just respond, take a breath, and then I'll respond and I'll be like, hey, can you give me a specific reason why it was denied? Again, under Illinois FOIA, they do have to give you site specific clauses or sections of statute as to the denial. And it could be as vague as like, it's unduly burdensome, or it could be like multiple paragraphs of cases and, binding pack agreement or binding pack rulings and things like that. But oftentimes it's just kind of a general misunderstanding. Like maybe there's a document that I was looking for that just doesn't exist, but I thought it did. Maybe there's a document that exists, but it's under a different name. And again, like Jim said, I think oftentimes FOIA officers are really swamped. And if they have a chance to do a denial and take work off their plate, I think sometimes they will, just because it's the only way that they can, kind of keep the office running without going underwater. But yeah, are there any tips and tricks aside from what we shared in the slides that you have, Jim?
I don't believe so. I think we got everything I know in the slides.
Okay.
But everybody, I put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions that we didn't get to, or if you think of a question later on, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm busy, so if I don't respond, email me again and say, hey man, you need to respond to me. And I will happily get back to you.
All right, I think we are kind of coming up to the end here. I'm gonna just put in the chat links to the work that both Jim and Cam do. I hope you stay in touch with us, stay subscribed to our newsletters. We're really hoping to do another event like this probably in February. So hopefully if by then you filed some FOIAs, you come in with even more questions, or you can even come in with like a specific case that you're working on. And that session, we're hoping to go a little bit more in depth. So this was kind of an overview. Again, huge thank you to Cam and Jim. We will be sending out this recording as well. I think everybody has the slide deck. So with that, we are done. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Happy FOIAing.
Happy FOIA. Bye.